Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Taylor and Deacon vanish. Those two words alone exploded across Los Angeles like a flashbang, because in a megacity addicted to visibility, exposure is the loudest possible act, and what unfolded in the breathless hours that followed was a storm of enterprise, rumored sightings, blurred security footage, frantic phone calls unanswered, sidekicks claiming ignorance, musketeers offering nervous half-denials, and a growing, inarguable consummation that Taylor and Deacon, the most watched, deconstructed, brooded about brace in recent memory, hadn't simply stepped out for sequestration or taken a routine break, but had orchestrated commodity far more deliberate, cinematic, and shocking a secret escape out of LA, executed under cover of darkness, with perfection that suggested weeks perhaps months, of planning, as if they had eventually decided that the megacity which erected them, fed on them, and no way stopped watching them had come a pen they could no longer breathe outside. The first cracks appeared when Taylor failed to show up to an unrestricted door assiduity regale she had tete-a-tete verified hours before, followed by Cleric missing a late-night plant session that interposers said he would no way skip, driving a waterfall of red flags that grew louder when neighbors in Taylor's reopened enclave reported a bartered-out SUV footling just after night, no headlights, no music, machine running low, the kind of vehicle that doesn't want to be flashed back, while a cross-city analogous auto was seen outside Deacon's place, bringing luggage out in unmarked cases that looked nothing like a casual late bag and everything like the kind of packing you do when you don't know when or if you're coming back. By dawn, their phones were dark, their socials silent, sidekicks unobtainable, and the scuttlebutt shop had burned, churning out propositions ranging from a hype trick to a breakdown to commodity far more romantic and dangerous, because as the hours stretched on and no interpretations came, one narrative began to dominate all others. Taylor and Deacon didn't just leave Los Angeles, they ran, together, and the counter-accusations of that possibility were explosive, given the long history of just musketeers, denials, the precisely curated public distance, the suspicious timing of lapping breaks, the way their names always sounded to surface in the same apartments without photographic evidence, and the inarguable chemistry suckers had been clocking for times, anatomizing ganders, pauses, untreated rulings, lyrics that felt too pointed to be coexistence, interviews where answers drifted toward each other indeed when questions didn't, sources near to the situation, some pious, some easily shaken, began oohing fractions of a story that painted their exit not as impulsive chaos but as a controlled burn, with Taylor still dealing off plant outfit weeks agone. Cleric transferring operation liabilities to a deputy, both of them disentangling from commitments in ways that only make sense in hindsight, like chess players immolating pieces long before the checkmate is visible, and also came the most ruinous detail of all: airline manifests flagged under aliases, a private flight filed with a destination that changed doubly in 48 hours, and a security contractor known for handling high-profile discoveries rather than glamorous recesses, suggesting that whatever Taylor and Deacon were running toward, or down from, needed not just sequestration but sequestration, distance, and presumptive deniability. The expression "running down together" exploded online, equal corridor fantasy and blameworthiness, because if true, it meant everything people allowed they knew about their relationship had been a performance, a long con offered for survival in an assiduity that punishes authenticity when it disrupts branding, contracts, or prospects. And suddenly every once denial sounded less like honesty and more like tone preservation, every awkward laugh in an interview a cube, every deviation a guard, until now, when commodity had eventually snapped or solidified enough to justify burning islands in the most dramatic way possible. What pushed them to this point remains the most contested question, with some interposers brooding about a brewing expose, others about legal pressure, creative suffocation, or an claim delivered still and irrevocably, but those closest to Taylor hint at prostration deeper than reproach, a weariness born of being watched too nearly for too long, while Deacon's camp murmurs about treason, control, and a line crossed that made staying insolvable. And when you fuse two people both hopeless for escape, both professed at secretiveness, both important enough to pull it off, you get a night evaporating that feels less like a tabloid caption and more like the opening act of a larger, foreigner story. Sightings began trickling in by day 2, coarse prints of a familiar figure in a European terminal, a voice matching Deacon's meter eavesdropped at a literal cafe far from California, A woman who looked unmistakably like Taylor wearing a baseball cap pulled downward, laughing freely in a way she no way does when cameras are anticipated, each report unconfirmed yet inclusively conclusive, because absence on this scale creates its own graveness, pulling every coexistence into route around it, and the longer Taylor and Deacon remain silent, the further their silence speaks, suggesting intention, resoluteness, and maybe relief. Assiduity fallout has been nippy and brutal, with meetings cancelled, systems broke, brands scrabbling to understand whether they've been wormed or simply delayed, and a palpable fear that whatever verity emerges could upend precisely negotiated narratives, because if Taylor and Deacon truly chose each other over the machine, it sends a dangerous, exhilarating communication to everyone watching that escape is possible, that the limelight can be overrun, that love or fidelity or reason might still be worth further than the endless churn of visibility, and that idea terrifies an assiduity erected on access and control. Suckers, meanwhile, are resolved between heartache and admiration, some feeling betrayed by secretiveness, others inspired by the audacity of it all, idealizing the image of two people slipping away while the megacity slept, choosing a life undressed, unposted, and unapproved, and as days turn into weeks with no sanctioned statement, no coordinated return, no precisely framed explanation, the story only grows, shifting from reproach to legend, from scuttlebutt to myth, because in Los Angeles, stars are supposed to burn out or fade down under the lights, not vanish into the dark hand in hand, and whether Taylor and Deacon resurface hereafter with a polished explanation or no way return at each, their evaporating has formally rewritten the rules of what people believe is possible, leaving behind an echoing question that no source, sighting, or leak has yet answered. Were they running from commodity, or eventually running toward themselves, and toward each other, and if so, what does it mean when the most shocking act in a megacity erected on spectacle is choosing to leave it behind together? And as the shockwave from their exposure continued to ripple outward, the narrative around Taylor and Deacon began to evolve from raw astonishment into commodity thick, darker, and far more cerebral, because once the original delirium of where are they started to exhaust itself, a deeper question took its place: why now? And why like this? And it was in that vacuum that the story stopped being just about a secret flight and started getting a vote on everything the two of them had endured independently and together inside a system that rewards abidance until it suddenly devours you for surviving too long. Interposers who had formerly been eager to talk now grew conservative, as if realizing delinquently that every word they'd partake might eventually be read as substantiation in a narrative Taylor and Deacon were designedly refusing to recite themselves. And that turndown came its own act of defiance, a silent statement louder than any press release could ever be. Because Hollywood understands reproach, understands concession, understands redemption bends and comeback tenures, but it doesn't understand turndown, especially when it comes from people who were anticipated to play their places indefinitely. Still, stories began surfacing about the pressure Taylor had been under in recent months, the endless rewrites, the smiling compliance, the way she had allegedly started questioning contracts she formerly inked without vacillation, asking inconvenient questions about power, image, and autonomy, while Deacon, long praised for his intensity and discipline, had reportedly grown more withdrawn, less willing to compromise creatively, pushing back in apartments where he formerly jounced along, and when those circles bisected, it painted a picture not of a robotic romantic elopement but of two people reaching the same breaking point from contrary directions and deciding, maybe without indeed completely articulating it, that staying was no longer survivable. The idea that they planned their exit together didn't just energy gossip, it alarmed directors and instructors who understood exactly what it inferred, because collaboration requires trust, and trust at that position is dangerous when it isn't sanctioned, when it forms outside approved channels, when it prioritizes collective survival over institutional stability, and suddenly every participated design, every lapping timeline, every unexplained gap in their schedules looked less like coexistence and more like trial. There were whispers that the final decision formed after a private event where commodity was said, or demanded, that crossed an unnoticeable line, a moment when Taylor allegedly left beforehand, shaken, and Cleric followed not long after, and while no one could confirm what happened, those who saw them independently subsequently described the same thing: a calm that felt resolved rather than rattled, the calm of people who have formerly decided they're done negotiating. From there, the logistics fell into place with creepy effectiveness, as if contingency plans had been sitting still in the background for times, staying for the emotional detector to spark them, and that possibility, that they had always known escape might eventually be necessary, reframed everything about their public personas, casting once grins as armor, success as influence, and silence as strategy. Meanwhile, the public's relationship to the riddle grew decreasingly intimate, with suckers parsing not just old interviews and lyrics but body language, tone shifts, indeed pauses between words, constructing timelines that felt compulsive yet strangely tender, as if by understanding how Taylor and Deacon arrived then, they could justify their absence, forgive it, or at least make peace with it, and in doing so, the story came lower about annuity to answers and further about identification, because so numerous people honored the fantasy bedded in the escape, the desire to walk down without explanation, to choose one person and one direction and let the noise collapse behind you. Of course, not everyone was romantic about it, and critics were quick to point out the honor bedded in evaporating so fully, the coffers needed to vanish safely, the sequestration plutocrat and influence give. But indeed those reviews could end completely deaden the emotional power of the act, because honor does negate pressure. And escape doesn't always mean running from consequences, it occasionally means refusing to accept terms that were no way humane to begin with. As weeks passed with no vindicated sighting, no accidental leak, no slip-up that suggested a return was imminent, it came clear that whatever life Taylor and Deacon had stepped into was one they were fiercely guarding, and that protection extended indeed to each other, with no source close to either of them willing to confirm or deny their relationship status. As if the old rules of propinquity-grounded exposure no longer applied, that absence of evidence was maybe the most satisfying detail of all, because if this had been a trick, a concession tactic, or a temporary retreat, someone would have blinked by now, someone would have floated a trial balloon, tested the waters, comforted investors or suckers, but rather there was nothing, a chastened, collaborative nothing that suggested alignment not just in movement but in values. And that alignment, further than love, further than reproach, was what truly unsettled spectators, because it inferred a cooperation erected on participated boundaries rather than participated branding. Assiduity consequences continued to pile up till, with systems being retooled, scripts rewritten, and contingency plans actuated, yet no legal action materialized, no public demands were made, intimating that those in power might know further than they were willing to admit. Maybe indeed suspecting that pressing too hard would only confirm what everyone formerly stressed, that Taylor and Deacon had exited with influence, bills, and a amenability to let silence do the damage. The longer the story stretched without resolution, the more it began to feel like an artistic glass, reflecting back the cost of constant visibility, the fragility of curated closeness, and the strange violence of being constantly accessible. And in that reflection, Taylor and Deacon converted from subjects of gossip into symbols, not because they asked to be, but because exposure invites protuberance, and people filled the void with their own Jones. For escape, authenticity, and connection immediate by algorithms or contracts, whether they were living still abroad, moving between locales, or settled nearly designedly normal, the prevailing sense was that they had chosen a life that could end with the bone they left before. And that choice, unrecoverable, unapologetic, and collective, continued to resonate long after the captions lost their urgency, leaving behind a moping, uncomfortable verity for everyone still inside the machine that occasionally the most radical ending isn't collapse or reproach or reinvention, but simply walking down together and no way turning back. As time stretched on and the original adrenaline of the riddle cooled into commodity more reflective, the story of Taylor and Deacon entered a new phase. One defined less by enterprise about their whereabouts and further by the slow, unsettling consummation of what their absence was doing to everyone they left before, because exposure isn't a stationary event but a living pressure that reshapes connections, diligence, and narratives long after the moment itself has passed. Agents set up themselves contending calls they couldn't return with certainty, collaborators sat with untreated work that now felt firmed in amber, and musketeers who formerly participated jokes and inside references were forced to defy the uncomfortable boundary between closeness and access, realizing that knowing someone deeply doesn't guarantee a claim on their future, especially when that future is designedly undetermined. The silence from Taylor and Deacon had come not just a lack of information but a deliberate terrain, one that trained everyone around them to sit with nebulosity, to accept unanswered questions, and in that sense their evaporating worked like a kind of social trial, exposing how habituated people are to check, to statements, to justifications or explanations that neatly package dislocation into commodity digestible, and how destabilizing it feels when that packaging no way arrives. Inescapably, counter-narratives began to crop, some averring that the story was being bloated, that celebrities vanish all the time and return with new systems and fresh myths, but this time felt different precisely because there was no visible path back, no teaser, no controlled leak suggesting a reinvention bow, and the longer the absence endured, the clearer it came that if Taylor and Deacon ever did resurface intimately, it would be on terms that no longer recalled the bones they'd rejected. Behind unrestricted doors, directors and strategists began using their case as an exemplary tale, not about love or rebellion, but about constraint, about how important control can really be wielded over people whose value gives them options, and how fragile indeed the most watertight systems come when those people decide the cost of staying exceeds the benefits, because for all the talk of contracts and fidelity, the verity remained that no agreement can impel genuine presence once someone has emotionally exited, and Taylor and Deacon appeared to have done exactly that long before their physical departure made it inarguable. Culturally, the story began to cross with broader exchanges about collapse, surveillance, and the performance of identity, with think pieces framing their escape as a symptom rather than an anomaly, a sign that the pressure to be constantly available, constantly comprehensible, constantly profitable has reached a breaking point indeed for those who feel most insulated from its goods, and in that architecture, Taylor and Deacon were lower apostates than couriers, embodying a question numerous people were formerly asking intimately: what does success mean if it requires perpetual exposure, and at what point does the demand for translucency come a form of birth? Suckers, too, evolved in their response, moving from frantic curiosity to a quieter, more defensive station, policing rumors themselves, pushing back against invasive enterprise, and creating a kind of collaborative agreement that some stories don't belong to the followership. An unanticipated shift that suggested the exposure had altered not just how people saw Taylor and Deacon, but how they understood their own part as consumers of narrative, because loving someone's work doesn't entitle you to their life, and witnessing that boundary executed so absolutely forced a recalibration. Sometimes, a new scuttlebutt would flare, an alleged sighting, a supposed friend of a friend account, but these sparks now sizzled snappily, lacking the oxygen they formerly had, as if the public had grown tired of chasing ghosts and rather begun esteeming the graveness of the choice that had been made, and in that respect, the escape succeeded on a deeper position, tutoring restraint through illustration rather than instruction. Meanwhile, the tradition continued to consolidate in subtle ways, with their last public moments acquiring a nearly archival significance, every interview clip and snap recontextualized as a final artifact from an unrestricted chapter, and scholars of pop culture began treating the exposure as a narrative endpoint rather than a thriller, arguing that its power lay precisely in its turndown to resolve, in its resistance to the cyclical measures of downfall and return that dominate celebrity lyre. For Taylor and Deacon themselves, wherever they were, the counter-accusations of their decision likely unfolded in far quieter ways, in mundane routines reclaimed from chaos, in obscurity that felt both liberating and disorienting, because walking down from a life that defined you so intimately doesn't incontinently grant peace. It demands reconstruction, the slow work of discovering who you're when no bone is watching, when applause is absent, when your value is no longer externally measured, and if they were truly together, navigating that terrain as a unit would bear not just affection but tolerance, honesty, and the courage to let each other change outside the familiar scripts that formerly bound them. There's a temptation, especially in stories like this, to glamorize the escape as a perfect result, a fairy tale ending where love conquers assiduity and silence equals freedom, but the verity is nearly clearly more complicated, because leaving doesn't abolish the pressures that shaped you, it simply removes the followership, and the work of mending, reconsidering, and choosing each other menial would continue long after the captions faded, unglamorous and unseen, yet indeed admitting that complexity doesn't dwindle the radical nature of what they did, because in a culture that monetizes vulnerability and demands constant updates, choosing nebulosity is an act of power, and choosing it together amplifies that power into commodity transformative, not just for the individualities involved but for the ecosystem that depended on their pungency. As months turned into a time, the question of where are they now came nearly inapplicable, replaced by a more continuing inquiry into heritage, because heritage is only what you leave before but how you leave, and Taylor and Deacon left in a way that refused commodification, refused explanation, and refused to be neatly folded back into the narratives that had sustained them, and in doing so, they sculpted out a strange new space in artistic memory, one where absence speaks louder than presence ever did. Maybe eventually they will tell their story, or fractions of it, on their own terms, or maybe they no way will, and either outgrowth feels harmonious with the sense of their departure, because the point was no way to be understood, it was to be free, and as the world continues to spin without them, conforming, forgetting, mythologizing in equal measure, their evaporating remains a quiet challenge moping at the edge of collaborative knowledge, asking anyone who encounters it to consider what they would be willing to leave before in order to truly choose themselves, and whether they would be stalwart enough to do it without saying goodbye.